Becoming an archaeologist was a dream come true. It had not been easy. When I was at university in London, I had to work a night shift to make ends meet and then study all day while struggling to keep my eyes open. There had been other challenges along the way, strange, terrifying challenges, but I had made it. I was teaching archaeology at a university in the north of England. The academic year had finished and these students had left the campus, but I had stayed. I had been planning on spending the summer break quietly cataloging objects in the archaeological department storeroom until I was almost killed by a 1,000-year-old dagger. Welcome to my life. I had taken the dagger out of the box where it had been stored and was looking for a blank label when it flew through the air. It missed me by inches and ended up embedded in the wall. That was disturbing enough on its own, but what made it worse was that I was the only person in the room. The dagger must have been propelled by some unseen force, some entity. This wasn't the first time that I had encountered unnatural, malevolent forces during the course of my work. That did not take the sting out of the terror that I felt in that moment. A bead of sweat trickled down my neck and I began to shake. I looked around the room again. It all seemed so normal, so dusty and dull. There were shelves covered in storage boxes, shelves with stationery on, a no smoking sign on the wall. I thought how great it would have been if somebody had put up a no ancient evil sign, and I bit down on a hysterical laugh. I needed to stay calm and rational. But one of the boxes was moving. Its lid rattled and then the entire box began to shake. And then, in one sudden movement, it toppled off the shelf and landed on the floor. The box next to it did the same and then the next. Whatever was doing this was sweeping them off the shelves. I had never encountered a poltergeist before, but that struck me as the most likely cause of this. And this poltergeist was working itself up into a frenzy. More boxes were sent flying and now the contents that spilled out were being whipped up into the air as well. I dodged just in time as the large bronze coin went spinning past my head. A stone tablet with symbols etched into it shattered at my feet. Seeing this historically precious artifact destroyed appalled me. For a moment, I forgot my fear and I yelled out, "Stop it!" I immediately regretted this. An axe had tumbled out of one of the boxes and now it rose up from the floor, hovered in midair for a moment and then flew at speed towards me. The poltergeist's aim was thankfully once more just off, and the axe span past my cheek. As it did, I felt a sharp pain in my ear. I touched the lobe gingerly and then looked at my finger. There was blood there. The axe had nipped me, and now it was rising back up into the air, ready to strike. The door was closed and I was too far away for me to make it in one piece. I did the only thing that I could think of. I pleaded for my life. "Please don't hurt me," I begged. "I am not your enemy. I will help you if I can." The axe halted and then dropped to the ground. Moments later, I felt a disturbance in the air as if someone was standing right next to me. And then a cold breath touched my cheek and I heard a voice whisper, "You say you will help me, you who is so afraid." I shivered and said, "Yes, I will help." The cold breath drifted over me and I heard the voice say, "Release me. I killed with the dagger and was killed with it, and now it holds me close, the cursed thing. Release me. Break the dagger, snap its blade. Let me be free." The words ended in a sigh that felt like ice pressing against my skin. I swallowed down bile which had risen into the back of my mouth, and I moved slowly towards the dagger. I would do what the poltergeist had wanted, to save myself. The dagger was still embedded in the wall. I tried to pull it out, but it was stuck too firmly. Instead, I pulled down on it with all my weight and finally, the old metal had cracked and broke. Its tip was still in the wall, but the rest was snapped off. I had broken the dagger as I had been asked. And as I stood there looking dumbly at the remnant in my hand, I felt the air around me begin to move. It quickened and whirled as if there was a storm in the room, and then as quickly as it began, the movement stopped. Everything was still and silent, and instinct told me that I was truly alone. The poltergeist had been released and had left. It was time for me to do the same. I ran for the door, dashed out, slammed it behind me, and then stood there breathing heavily. The corridor stretched out on either side of me. Thankfully, I couldn't sense any spirits, but there was someone there. They were shuffling along, and they were reassuringly familiar. Professor Halliburton was the head of the archaeological department at the university. He was dressed as always in a very smart, double-breasted suit with a bow tie. When he saw me, he looked concerned. "Are you all right?" he asked. "You look very pale." I did not think the professor would believe me if I told him what had happened, so I decided it was best to lie. "Yes," I said, "I'm fine, it's just, there are rats in the storeroom, big rats. There's damage, I'm afraid, and we can't open the door because they'll get out." The professor looked at me for a moment and then said, "Oh, that's unfortunate. I will arrange for a sign to be placed on the door saying, 'Out of bounds,' and put in a request for exterminators. There will be a form for that somewhere, and a budget code." I grinned nervously and said, "That sounds great." The professor smiled back at me and asked, "And in the meantime, am I correct in thinking that you now have some spare time on your hands?" "I was so going to spend the summer working in the storeroom," I replied. "So, yes, I do." "Well, excellent," he said. "In that case, I have a new project for you." The next morning, I set off for the coast. The professor had provided me with a comprehensive briefing, and folders were piled high on the back seat of the hired car, along with a laptop and the other equipment that I would need. I was traveling and I would be working on my own. And that suited me just fine, and I whistled tunelessly as the miles sped past. It was early afternoon when I arrived. The sun shone and the sea was calm. The water looked inviting, and for a moment I thought about going for a swim. But even in summer, the sea around England is cold. And then there were the jellyfish to think about, and the pollution. I decided that I would go swimming amiss and turn my attention to the job at hand. I had parked up next to one of the bunkers. It was a squat structure constructed of concrete, and even after 8 decades of being battered by the wind and rain, it still looked extremely sturdy. There was an access door at the back, though the wood from which this had been made had rotted away, and now there was just the remains of the frame leading to the darkness within. I walked around to the front of the bunker, and this was where the observation point was, a long narrow slit cut into the concrete. The soldiers who had been posted here in World War II would have spent hour after hour standing inside the bunker, peering out through the opening at the sea. Their mission was to watch for invading forces sailing for the mainland. This part of the coast was otherwise deserted, and it would have made an ideal landing point. If enemy ships were sighted, the troops' first actions would be to radio headquarters, and once this was done, the soldiers' orders were to stay and fight the invaders when they made landfall. They were also forbidden to leave the bunker for any reason. It would likely become their tomb. I knew this from the professor's briefing. As anyone knows, England was not invaded during World War II, so none of the men stationed in the bunker met this chilling fate. Still, it must have been cold, and a lonely experience which left the nerves of the bravest stretched to breaking point. I shivered as I imagined this, and then snapped myself back into the here and now and went to fetch the equipment that I would need from the car. This bunker was one of a network that had been established on this section of the coastline. The nearest neighboring bunker to my position was less than a mile away, and I would move on to it next. They had all been abandoned at the end of the war and left to fall into ruin. I was to record the existing structures and look for any artifacts left behind by the troops. The university was being paid to do this by a branch of the government. The professor did not know why an interest was being shown after all these years. though he did air the suspicion that it was to do with spending all of that year's budget so next year's would not be cut. It all comes down to money at the end of the day, he had said. Academic motives take a back seat. And he was right, unfortunately, but as I set up the camera to begin taking the images from which I would construct a 3D digital map of the bunker, I started to forget about the outside world. The past was drawing me in. After capturing the exterior of the bunker, I set up inside. The daylight creeped in, but not enough for the camera, so I brought a portable light and set it up on a tripod. Once the photography was complete, I began to examine the ground. Working quickly but not rushing, I searched through the dry, dark earth. I uncovered a cigarette lighter missing its top, a fork, and what appeared to be a human tooth. It was riddled with decay, and I wondered if there had been some amateur dentistry carried out in the bunker. If one of the soldiers had a bad toothache, this would have been the only practical option. Moving outside the bunker, I found a number of the cans which would have held most of their diet in the ground. It would have been tinned meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There were also clusters of rabbit bones which showed signs of damage from bullets. Not the subtlest way of catching fresh food, but out there no one would have cared how many pot shots the soldiers took. None of these finds have a wow factor, but they all helped to build up a picture. I bagged the last of my finds and carried it to the back of the car. I had lost track of time while I was working and noticed for the first time that the sun was dipping over the horizon. I hadn't eaten or drunk anything or put up the tent that I would be sleeping in. First things first, I figured, and I searched through my supplies for a can of beans. It was dark by the time that I had finished my basic meal and I got the tent up, but I wasn't feeling sleepy. I decided to go for a walk and check out the next bunker. I pulled on a coat and grabbed a torch and I set off. I had not seen a single person since I had arrived, and as I had skirted the coast, there was only darkness all around me. There were no boats out at sea and no buildings interrupting the bleak, flat landscape. The only sound was my breathing. The rest of the world could have faded away into nothingness for all that I could see and hear. These thoughts were making me feel unsettled, and I was considering turning back when my torch picked out the outline of a bunker. Now that I had come all this way, I might as well keep going, I had decided, and I continued towards the ruin. It appeared identical to the bunker that I had recorded earlier, but would, I knew, have had its own small group of soldiers stationed there. If they had followed their orders to the letter, there would have been no contact between them and the soldiers in the first bunker. They would have been alone in the world until they were stood down. I walked around the outside of the bunker, running the torch beam up and down its pitted concrete walls. The light touched the edges of the observation slot, and as it did so, I heard movement inside, a scrabbling sound that made me jump. I stood stock still and I listened for a moment, but there was nothing. It was silent once again. It must have been a rat, I told myself. A rat or something like it moving around inside the bunker, and I had let it spook me. I shook my head and, with a rueful smile on my face, continued around to the back of the bunker and its way in. I played the torch beam across the ground nearest to the opening, expecting to see a rodent scurrying around, and when there was no sight of anything furry and four-legged, I stepped inside. The far walls of the bunker were lost in the darkness, so I raised the torch and saw that there was someone in the bunker. The shock of this made me drop the torch and it clattered to the ground. In the second or two that the light had been on them, I had glimpsed a man. He was standing in a corner looking right at me. And now with my eyes adjusting, I could just about make out his face without the help of the torchlight. His expression was still veiled by the darkness. I assumed that he must be homeless and was sleeping rough in the bunker. I took a deep breath to calm myself and I reached down to try and find the torch. It was lying by my feet. The light had been knocked off in the fall, and as I picked it up and searched for the switch with my fingers, I said, "No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you." The man's gaze remained fixed on me, but he did not reply. "Are you okay?" I asked, wondering if he was hurt or ill, out here in the middle of nowhere on his own. He answered with a sigh at first, a strangely guttural, ragged sound, and then he spoke. "I am waiting," he said. "I've been waiting for so long. Since the storm and the lightning struck, I had been waiting and watching for the enemy to come." I saw his head tilt to one side. I couldn't see his eyes clearly but felt that they were boring into me, a sensation that made my skin crawl. I suddenly wanted to get away from him. I took a step backwards, and as I did so, he stepped towards me and said, "Halt. I have waited and I have watched. I have done my duty, and now you are here. I have to know, are you friend or foe?" He took another step towards and finally managed to turn the torch on. Its beam revealed a nightmare, a hideous apparition. The skin of the man's face had rotted away, darkened to scraps of dead flesh now hung from bones, which shone sickly yellow in the light of the torch. I could see more exposed bones between the torn rags that he wore. They had once been a uniform, and I had realized with dawning horror what this thing was. It had been a soldier, and this had been its post. Somehow it had remained here, caught between life and death, trapped in an endless vigil. And now it wanted to know, had its enemy come? Was I the invader it had waited and watched for? I held up my hands and said, "No, please, I'm not a soldier. I'm not your foe. I'm an archaeologist, a teacher. I'm your friend." Tears were running down my face as I spoke. Terror and sadness mingled inside me as I faced this lost, distorted soul. It was considering me, I could tell. Even with its ravaged features, I could see that it was thinking. "Friend," it echoed me and then asked, "But what about the war?" "The war ended in 1945, I told it, almost 80 years ago. It asked no more questions then and walked slowly past me out of the bunker, leaving its post after so many wasted years. I followed. I was no longer afraid. The thing that had been a soldier stood looking out to sea. The waves were crashing gently against the beach as the first traces of dawn appeared at the edges of the sky. "I have often thought how beautiful the ocean is," it said, and then it turned to me. "I am tired and my time is over. Thank you, friend." I watched as it walked away, down onto the beach and on and into the ocean. I watched as the waves lapped over its body, taking the soldier into its embrace. I stood there for a long while afterwards, feeling weighed down by an immense sadness, and then I dragged myself back to the car. I packed up my things and then drove to the bunker where the soldier had been waiting, and I surveyed it and collected the artifacts. I did my job. I couldn't think of what else to do. There were half a dozen bunkers along the stretch of coast, and I meticulously made a record of all of them over the days that followed, and then emailed the professor to tell him that I had completed the project. I still felt very down and without work to keep me busy, and I felt lost as well. When the professor replied to ask me if I could start work on another project half a day's drive away, I replied with a sense of relief that I could. A few hours later, after going through the attachments and links that the professor sent me, I was back on the road. The destination was a fortification established in the 12th century on a major trade route. Controlling the flow of goods and taking a cut of profits made was a solid business model for any nobleman who wanted to build and consolidate their power. The trade route was now a line on the map that only archaeologists used, following a dirt track that overlaid some of the old route for part of the way, and then off-roading in a vehicle that really wasn't made for leaving tarmac. I reached the site. The fortification was reduced to scattered blocks of stone, poking up from untamed undergrowth. The positions, dimensions, and functions of the various areas of the building were impossible to tell by the naked eye alone. They would be specified by the large-scale excavation that was planned for the site next summer. Subject as ever to funding being in place, I was there to do some preparatory work and decided to make a start straight away. I walked what I believed to be the perimeter of the site and put down marker poles. I would use these to create a basic map, and then I paced out a grid and chose a square towards the center to do a test dig. Thankfully, there wasn't a scrap of litter in sight. Somehow cans and fast food wrappers seemed to find their way into so much of the beautiful English countryside, but the ruins were free of all traces of the modern world. I could have been the only person in the world, or so it felt once more, as I rolled up my sleeves and began to move away the grass and the weeds, and a scattering of leaves before starting on the upper layer of earth. I was soon totally focused on the melancholy which had infected me, following my encounter with the soldier it eased. It was evening before I took a break, eating cold stew out of a can and sipping on a carton of fruit juice, while sitting with my back against a block of stone. The glamorous life of an archeologist. My belly full and feeling a bit queasy, the stew that I had noticed far too late was 2 years out of date. I leaned my head against the stone and I closed my eyes. I was just going to rest for a minute before putting in at least another couple of hours of hard work before nightfall. But the stress of the last few days must have caught up with me, and the next thing I knew, I was coming around. I was disoriented and damp. The morning dew glistened on the grass and the weeds and me. I stretched and then grimaced at the pain in the back of my head. Serves me right for using a stone as a pillow, I thought, and I smiled despite the discomfort. Once I had poured a bottle of water over my head, which was the nearest thing I was going to get to a shower with my setup, I cleaned my teeth with a twig and ate some crackers and cheese, and that was it. I was ready for another day. The professor had not specified how long that I should spend on site. It felt pretty good being out there and I had a few supplies left, so I decided to spend another half-day excavating by hand, and then work on the mapping of the site, and I could head back to campus after that. I retrieved my trusty compact shovel from the ground, where I had planted it, and I returned to the square that I had started clearing. I had found nothing of interest yet, so I decided to go deeper. My tuneless whistling filled the air as I dug. Around noon, I struck something solid. I put the spade to one side and cleared the dirt away with my fingers. Before long, I had uncovered a complete human skeleton. It lay on its back, and it was not alone. The finger bones of another skeleton were also visible. In my imagination, they seemed to be reaching out for the other skeleton. I got to work on the second set of remains. Although I had slept deeply the night before, I think the recent events must have affected my decision-making. I should have taken a step back and called my findings in. The professor would have wanted to know as soon as possible, and would most likely have sent additional personnel to help. But I was like a man possessed. I was driven to keep digging and did not pause until the sun was once more dipping in the sky. I got painfully to my feet and looked out over the scene that I had revealed. I had uncovered dozens of skeletons. They were lying together in a pit. The proximity told me that this was not an ordinary graveyard, where the dead had been laid to rest over a number of years. I could also not see any obvious signs of injuries on the bones. If they had been killed in battle there, there would be clear fractures caused by the impacts of swords and axes. Skulls would be cracked and teeth smashed. The reasoned alternative this left was that I was looking at the burial site of people who had died as a result of disease, of some mass outbreak of a fatal malady. I wiped sweat from my brow with my sleeve and I swallowed. My mouth suddenly felt very dry. I had read of incidences where mass graves such as this had been uncovered by archaeologists and where traces of ancient diseases had been found. Still active cells that could have infected those working on the excavations. I swore to myself, I needed to put some distance between myself and this potentially hazardous place. Only just as I was turning to walk away, I noticed there was something moving in the pit. There were dark specks among the bones. There were flies, I realized. A few dozen at first, I thought. A small cloud of insects hovering around the bones. But the closer I looked, the more flies that I saw. There were hundreds, darting and dancing in the air. The earth beneath and between the skeletons appeared to be moving as well, because it was thick with flies, crawling over the soil and onto the bones. Within seconds, the bones were covered, and then to my horror, the flies began to swarm. There were thousands now, and the air itself grew dark as the flies rose and spread and intertwined. Disgust rippled through me as more and more flies appeared, yet I couldn't take my eyes off this repulsive spectacle, not even as the storm of the flies came closer and closer to me. They were starting to brush against my face and my fingers where I tried to push them away. I felt them landing on my scalp, crawling across my lips. I saw dark, distorted shapes as they almost touched my eyes. I breathed the flies in, felt the soft, wet grits of their bodies in my mouth and spat them out. They were starting to cover me as they had covered the dead. I cried out in horror. I couldn't help myself, and the flies welcomed the invitation that my open mouth offered and more rushed in. I felt my throat clog with the sudden mass of them and I began to choke. I needed to somehow get away from them. If I didn't, I would suffocate. I stumbled backwards, fell, got back up to my feet and started to run. The car was close and I reached it, pulled the door open and clambered in. I slammed the door. My skin was still crawling with flies and a host of them filled the car, but no more seemed to be getting in. I spat again and coughed and retched to try to clear my throat, and I wiped my eyes, smearing the bodies of flies against my skin. I had left the key in the ignition and still half blind, managed to find it by touch and turned it. The engine kicked into life and the car lurched forwards. I grabbed the steering wheel desperately with both hands as I slammed down my foot onto the accelerator. Getting out of it was the only thing that I cared about, and I did not see the block of stone that was sticking up out of the ground until it was too late. The car hit it with a sickening jolt and the world went dark. Until the point of light flared and then another, and I opened my eyes. Intense pain tore along my nerves and I tensed. Tears rolled down my face, and then the first wave of agony passed. I tried to focus, saw the windscreen was cracked and smoke drifted from the engine beneath the crumpled bonnet. The stone remnant of the fortification that it had struck stood firm. In those first seconds of consciousness, I had forgotten the flies. But now I jumped in shock when I saw that my lap and my legs and my arms and hands, they were covered in dead flies. They were on the steering wheel as well and over the dashboard and the pedals, and outside the car the ground was carpeted with them. I didn't know how long I had been out for, but it seemed the flies' lives had been brief. They had flared, but now they were reduced to thousands and thousands of tiny corpses. I opened the door of the car and I fell out. The air was still and silent and I was alone. I stood propped up against the car. Relief and hysteria blurred into one overwhelming emotion, and I started to weep. It was over, I thought. I had survived. I would have to walk out of there, but that was okay. I rubbed my face and I felt nauseous and had a terrible taste in my mouth, and there was a horrible smell as well, one that I did not remember. It seemed to be coming from the pit where the skeletons were. With a fresh dread rising through my body, I felt my attention drawn back to the bones and the earth beneath. The smell was getting worse. It was the rank stench of decay, of rotting flesh and spore-riddled matter. I started to gag. I had thought this nightmare was ending, but I couldn't have been more wrong, because something was emerging from the ground. It was pushing the bones to one side as the soil fell away from its grotesque body. It was tall and slender and swayed like a snake that was poised to attack. Its flesh was covered in open sores. Pus dripped from these and clung to skin drained of all color. Its face was a twisted hybrid of a man and beast, with a mouth that looked like it had been made by the cut of a ragged blade. This crude slash opened, exposing jagged teeth. Above this fearsome maw, the creature's eyes were dark and unblinking orbs, and they were fixed on me. And they remained so as the creature's body dipped, and it started to slither towards me. I felt feverish with terror, and I knew that I was about to die. And then cold touched my face, an icy ripple of air, and I heard a voice, a whisper. "You released me." It was the poltergeist. It had returned and it was saying, "You released me from the blade. This placed me in your debt, so I followed you, and now I will repay." As the last of its words fell into place, the ripple grew rapidly into a strong spiraling wind that began to lift the corpses of the flies back into the air. It lifted the flies in the dirt with them, and then the wind began to rage. It tore the bones from their resting place and span them through the air. It ripped the car from the ground and ripped up the block of stone into which the car had crashed, and they joined the melee of debris, which was spinning faster and faster. The creature paused and looked up, and its eyes grew wide as the debris began to fall onto it. The skull smashed against it, ribs shattered over it, dirt and dead flies shot into it. Then the car and the block of stone had crashed onto it, crushing it and killing it. As suddenly as it had begun, the spectral storm had ended, and I was left alone in the ruins of the ancient fortification. It was a still, clear evening, and I had survived. The poltergeist had paid the debt that it felt it owed. It had saved me and left. I stood there, feeling amazed and grateful, and I watched the sun fall below the horizon. The strangest of days was complete.